Good afternoon to those joining us here in the room in Bogota, and good morning and good evening to those joining us online from different time zones all over the world. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Tetyana Payosova. I'm a senior associate at Bael and Bellis in Geneva office, and I will be moderating this session. At the outset, on behalf of the SIEL Executive Board, I would like to express our gratitude to the local hosts, Università della and Università Externada, for hosting this year's edition of the biennial conference of the Society of International Economic Law here in Bogota. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this panel that will be dealing with two very timely and closely interrelated issues: the border carbon adjustments and climate clubs. Both issues are not new and have been discussed in the academic setting for at least a decade. And here, I just think of a book published actually by one of the speakers of our panel, Kateryna, back in 2014 on the border carbon adjustments. However, it is only now that states started implementing the border carbon adjustments and negotiating climate clubs in practice, keeping busy not only academics but also practitioners like myself. The implementation of the first BCA, the EU CBAM, will start on 1st October 2023 during the transitional phase, with the financial obligation kicking in on the 1st of January 2026. The US and the EU are currently negotiating the so-called Global Sustainable Steel Arrangements, with an ambitious target to reach an agreement already by October 2023. The GSSA would introduce an import duty on steel and aluminum that have higher carbon intensity than the agreed benchmark. The US is pursuing similar arrangements with Japan and the United Kingdom. And also the G7 countries have announced the creation of the so-called climate club. About these initiatives, we will talk during this panel. I'm joined today by five exceptional speakers with the expertise on these issues, who will address the border carbon adjustments as well as the climate clubs from a practical and more systemic academic perspective. Starting on my left, Mariá Paula Sánchez is the Director of International Trade and Customs Law at the Colombian law firm Posse, Herrera, Ruiz, and Professor of Trade Remedies and Barriers to Trade at Università della. She works primarily on customs and foreign trade operations, including the implementation of customs optimization mechanisms, such as free trade zones, the planning and execution of cross-border operations, and the representation of clients in trade defense investigations and judicial customs processes. Alessandro Monti is Assistant Professor in Energy Law and Sustainability at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law. His research and teaching activities primarily focus on the interaction between climate change, trade, and investment law. He has recently published his monograph promoting renewable energy, the mutual supportiveness of climate and trade law with Edward Elber. His co-author, Goran Dominioni, unfortunately could not join us today. Kateryna Holzer is a senior researcher with the Center for Climate Change and Environment Law at the University of Eastern Finland Law School, where she leads a project on regulatory cooperation on carbon standards and teaches a course on international economic law and green transitions. Finally, Ilaria Espa is Associate Professor of International Economic Law at UC with tenure track and Senior Research Fellow at the World Trade Institute in Bern. She is also adjunct professor at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milano, and lead counsel on the National Resources Program at the Center of International Sustainable Development Law. Her expertise lies in international trade law and its intersections with sustainable development, with a focus in the areas of climate change, energy, and natural resources management. A few preliminary remarks on the structure of the panel. I will kick off this panel with a round of questions to the speakers based on the draft papers that they have prepared for this conference. We will then have about 20 minutes to take questions from the audience, both here in the room and those joining us online. So please, for those joining us online, you may also submit your questions. So without further ado, I suggest that we start here. Alessandro, in your paper, you explain what are the main features of the border carbon adjustments and their role in preventing carbon leakage. Could you please share with us the main insights from your research?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you all for being here. It's really great to see so many of you in this room and in online. Also on behalf of my co-author, Goran Dominioni, who unfortunately couldn't be here, so I'll try to do my best to also say some of the points he would have liked to make, but I'm sure I will never be able to do it as good as he would have. But coming to your question, so as you said, border carbon adjustment is a topic that has been discussed now for many years from a theoretical perspective, and this year probably it's particularly relevant to talk about border carbon adjustment because now we're moving from the theory to the practice, at least in the EU, with the adoption of the EU CBAM regulation, which will soon become operational, entering into force in October, and then from 2026 also have the financial component kicking in. So we can safely say that BCA or CBAM, we'll say CBAM today just to keep things easier, is no longer just theoretical, but it's really a reality. So why is that countries want to move ahead and adopt such mechanisms? The answer is indeed to tackle the risk of carbon leakage, to address the fact that countries and in the case of the EU, of course, supranational organizations have different levels of ambition when it comes to climate change policies. And in some cases, they are willing to voluntarily adopt stringent standards, impose carbon taxes, other kinds of fees to reflect the externalities that are related to the production of certain products from a climate change perspective. And other jurisdictions either don't do that or they do it to a lesser extent. So if we look at different world regions, we know that the levels of implementation of climate change policies differs. And this is also very much a consequence of the Paris Agreement. And I also come from a climate change perspective. So if we look at the Paris Agreement and the bottom-up approach that characterizes the agreement, we know that countries have very much leeway in deciding to what extent they want to adopt climate policies. They submit nationally determined contributions, NDCs that are on a voluntary basis, and therefore it is quite natural that ultimately we have divergences in the level of climate ambition. But this, while it can work in the dynamics of the Paris Agreement and also coming from Kyoto, where the system was different, there have been many challenges in following that model. But at the same time, it opens up this risk of carbon leakage, of certain jurisdictions attracting the production of goods that is more harmful from a climate perspective because of the lack of stringent climate policies. So by implementing a border carbon adjustment mechanism, it is possible to respond to this by applying a levy or a fee at the import of certain goods that are produced with an amount of carbon emissions that is higher than the ones of goods produced domestically, or at least is not internalized. So essentially, the whole point of border carbon adjustment mechanisms is to level the playing field and make sure that the burden of climate change policies is shared equally across different jurisdictions. Now, there are, of course, different ways to do it, and this reflects also the different design options that are available for CBAMs in general. And now we have the one of the EU as the model that is more concretely available, but the US, Canada, and the UK are all working at their own separate models, which to a larger or smaller extent differ from the European one. And we will get back to this also when discussing the issues of compatibility with WTO law. But in general, one thing that should be common to the different models of border carbon mechanisms is to internalize externalities, as I said, and thereby reconciling also climate and trade. Because we should not forget that one of the aims of the WTO or with the Marrakesh Agreement is also to promote sustainable development. It is to make sure that there is a mutual supportiveness of climate and trade law, and considering the amount of emissions that are embedded in global trade, which is estimated in around 1/4, around between 20 and 30% of global emissions are embedded in trade, according to the WTO's own data. It is therefore quite necessary to introduce mechanisms that address this impact of trade from a climate change perspective. Therefore, CBAM is a climate change policy, but we argue that it's also a policy that is very much consistent with what should be the aim of the WTO. So it's at its core a very significant trade policy as well. And maybe I'll stop there because then I will continue later with the different options for CBAMs.
Great, thank you so much, Alessandro. So as you have mentioned, carbon border adjustment measures have an impact on trade. And Mariá, in your paper as a practitioner, you have focused specifically on the practical aspects of the implementation of DCAs, and in particular of the EU CBAM. Could you possibly share with us what are the key practical implications of the border carbon adjustment on trade? For instance, taking the example of the implications of the EU carbon border adjustment for Colombia and other countries of South America.
Sure, thank you. So to talk about possible implication for Latin American countries, it's important to look for some data to understand how important are those goods, the export of those goods into the European Union, and how reliant are those markets. So just for context, CBAM will affect approximately 6 to 7% of the EU's total imports in terms of value of goods. That percentage may seem not quite important, but in number is quite material. If you see, according to the 2022 results, CBAM regulation is set to impact nearly 544.5 billion, which is the worth of the current imports into the European Union. From the Latin American perspective, this event will only have a moderate or even low impact, affecting approximately 2.5 to 3.5% of the total value currently exported to the EU. This translates to around 4.5 billion out of the total export value of the region of 138.5 billion in 2022. That's why the impact is moderate or low. If we see the impact to industries, of course, as you see here in the pie, iron and steel industry is going to be probably the most affected by the measure, followed by electricity, aluminium, fertilizers. Conversely, for cement and chemicals, it would bear the least effect. In chemicals, we're including hydrogen. And here in this chart, we see the Latin American most sensitive industry to the CBAM regulation. Here we see the different participation or market or the share in the total exports of the different industries, and also the compound annual growth rate for those industries. So here we see that from the Latin American perspective, the iron and steel industry will be the most affected because it accounts for 60.9% of the total exports affected. But also here we can see that fertilizer is also going to be an affected industry because also represents 34.2% of the total exports. But this specifically this sector has a very interesting component, annual growth rate of 35% from 2018 to 2020. So in general, Latin America does not heavily depend on the European Union for trade of these affected goods by the CBAM. Only around 9 to 10% of Latin America's total exports are destined for the EU, in contrast to the 45% directed towards the NAFTA countries or the USMCA countries, and 17% towards the BRIC nations, including Brazil. In this chart, we also see how reliant are the EU and Latin America on each other regarding the goods affected by the CBAM regulation. And here we see from the side of the demand, that is the EU perspective, and also for the supply side, that is the LATAM perspective. So here we see that the most affected here here we see that there's some connection between the goods affected by the CBAM between the two regions, but probably the fertilizer sector is going to be the one that will bear the brunt of the effect, because from the EU perspective, the imports from Latin America just account for around 5% of the total. But from the Latin American perspective, exports to the EU accounts for 21.8%. So that will represent a challenge to replace these trade partners. That is the objective. Here we see this last slide. In this slide, we see the CBAM impact on the specific Latin American countries based on the share of total export value to the EU. So here for the three main sectors, we see that for fertilizers, the most affected would be Trinidad and Tobago. That country is going to be the most affected because EU accounted for nearly 15% of the total Trinidad and Tobago fertilizers exports. And then it will be also important for Chile because the EU accounted for 11%. For iron and steel, as you see here, the Brazil is going to have a very significant impact because the EU accounted for nearly 17% of total Brazil iron and steel exports, and that makes the EU the second largest market for Brazilian iron and steel exports after China. And for aluminium, the most affected will be Venezuela because EU accounted for nearly 21% of total Venezuelan exports. And therefore, as you see out of the data, and that just finished here, as Latin America is not really reliant on EU for its exports and vice versa, this measure could pose a risk in this long-standing commercial relationship regarding these specific goods for these two regions. And if this measure is not seen as fair, if there is not enough support for implementation, and if the carbon price, the carbon payments remains largely in the market of the export markets, that is why I'm saying that can pose risk to these relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariá, for sharing this regional perspective. And I think it's very interesting to see, especially on your last slide, that obviously the CBAM will have not an even impact on countries in Latin America, and also depending on the specific sector, it might have different impact. Having said that, we of course also should keep in mind that the current scope of the CBAM is just the initial scope, right? And it's going to be expanded over time. So of course, the impact also on Latin American countries can change over time. I will have a related question on on the impact of CBAM on Latin American countries and possibly, the measures that Latin American countries take in response to the CBAM, for instance, introducing their own domestic carbon pricing systems. But before that, I would like to ask Kateryna or Ilaria to introduce the topic of climate clubs, what it is exactly. And in your paper, you discuss how recent initiatives, for instance, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism and also the GSSA could potentially be classified as climate clubs.
Maybe if you don't mind, I'll start, of course. First of all, I would like to say at the beginning two things. First, thank you for the organizing the panel, Tetyana. And second, that I'm very happy to be here to make it to all the way to Colombia. It is the first time I'm here, and I like it very much. And thank you for the hospitality. And well, the price to pay is my jet lag. And I now understand how Americans feel in Europe when they come. And I'm really skeptical. I was always skeptical about it, but now I feel it myself. Now, more to substance, to the substance. Let me say a few words on the theory of clubs so that we understand what we are talking about. I am half economist, half international lawyer. And for me, a club is this notion is based on the universal theory of clubs. It was developed a long time ago, if I'm not mistaken, in the 60s by James Buchanan. And this theory actually, according to this theory, good climate, a stable climate, is public good. Which means that we all can enjoy it without any restrictions. And we don't need to pay for it. And this good is always there. It is non-exploitable and it's non-arrivals. And so what does it mean in terms of climate? It means that actually countries can free ride. So it means that they can do nothing, but they can still participate in international agreements on if they don't live with any restrictions. And they usually they don't have a motivation to do anything because they can do it for free. And they can enjoy, and they want to do it at the expense of others. And this is what the theory of clubs says. And now, coming to a climate club, what is proposed by G7, actually, interestingly, although it bears the only mechanism which we staffed in our paper, which bears the name of the club, interestingly, it's the one which resembles this club of the list. And why is that so? Because it doesn't foresee any restrictions to non-members or any sanctions on non-members. Well, it foresees benefits for members, but no sanctions for non-members. And it is meant to be, at least how it is conceived at the moment, it is meant to be open and inclusive. And well, it is basically, it is meant to be for cooperation. And when we take the CBAM, the EU CBAM, and this global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum proposed by the US to the EU. Well, I'm not talking about the motivation for this proposal, but anyway, these two other mechanisms, although they don't bear any names of a club, they actually are the partner clubs. And let me explain. This UCBAM Although it is now conceived as a unilateral measure, it has all the potential in the future to grow into a plurilateral club. Why? Because it can have a snowball effect. Because by including this possibility of crediting for carbon prices paid by producers in other countries and deducting this paid carbon price in other jurisdictions from the CBAM fee, they Europeans motivate other countries to also to do something about climate policy and to introduce also some kind of carbon restrictions in this case in the form of a fee or in the form of an ETS emissions trading scheme or carbon tax or whatever. And so maybe there is a potential that some countries faced with the need of payment of this CBAM to Europeans, they also they would rather collect this fee for themselves to their budget rather than letting the EU take this money. And so, in some time, possibly, these countries would rather also introduce these restrictions, and they will join the EU-driven climate club, the EU CBAM-driven climate club. And a similar situation is with this global arrangement. The idea is, well, it has all the characteristics of a classical club because it has a limited membership. Now we are talking about 2 members, but who knows, maybe they will let some countries join on conditions they foresee, the US foresee. So I think Ilaria will talk a little bit on that. And the second characteristics of a club in this case of global arrangement is that it produces public good and what not a public, sorry, a club good. And what is that good? It is market access. And another characteristics is that it imposes sanctions on members in the form of a term. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I talked too much, but Ilaria still has something to like 1 minute.
Just add it. So probably you've already known, you really got the perspective we adopt in our paper. We just wanted to focus on the fact that although probably a bit improperly, we do characterize all of these initiatives under this big umbrella of climate clubs. We also stress some of the inherent differences that we actually can appreciate from what we know of these different initiatives. And one is obviously with respect to your goals, or at least with respect to the order of your priorities. So the G7, as Kateryna said, is it's meant to be an open, inclusive process. So the idea is that it's not meant in the first place to level the playing field, contrary to the CBAM, right? But it's really to encourage policy ambition in the climate change space through more cooperation that take various forms, for instance, cooperation on technology, the possibility to participate in MRV standards, emission standards, that then could eventually become internationally recognized beyond the club, right? This also implies different motives to join the club. On the one hand, in the G7 is mainly trying to belong to this like-minded group of countries, politically the good guys, right? Rather than being the ones who are left out with bad reputation. Whereas obviously in the case of the CBAM is the desire to avoid the fees, but in the case of the steel and aluminum arrangement is about, as I said, as Kateryna said already, is market access. This leads obviously to different outcomes in the sense that basically when we talk about the CBAM and the global steel and aluminum arrangement, there's very clear indications of what will be the benefits and what will be the sanctions. The G7 is actually much more open, so it is meant to be partnership of equals. So it's obviously this whole discussion leads to the discussion on ability compliance that we will get.
Thank you so much, Kateryna and Ilaria. And I was wondering, Mariá, so is this issue of climate clubs being discussed in Colombia or in other Latin American countries? Do you see some kind of, reaction in Colombia, and do you see it in the press? And also in general, given that we now have this EU CBAM, is there, first of all, what is the reaction of the, for instance, Colombian government? Is there a discussion of maybe introducing carbon pricing, or I don't know whether you have one already in Colombia, because I just came from Brazil, and I know that Brazilian government is currently working on introducing carbon pricing in Brazil, also as a reaction to the EU CBAM. And also in practical terms, as a practitioner, how do you see the Colombian businesses should prepare, or what should they take into account, exporting to the EU products that are covered by the EU CBAM?
First of all, about the climate clubs, actually Colombia could be a good candidate for that climate clubs. Colombia, of course, as you know, is signatory to the Paris Agreement, but also have embassy of reducing by 2030 the emissions, and by 2050 to reach carbon neutrality as well as also our government, the current government, has a very strong position about protecting environments and reducing the global warming. So it seems that we are aiming at the same goals. However, in order for the Latin American countries right now to have a strong position about climate clubs and CBAM, I think it's too early for that. And that is mainly because most of our countries in Latin America don't have a legal framework to regulate carbon markets. So let's just see like an overview, a quick overview. Mexico, for instance, could be the Latin American country more advanced in carbon markets, because Mexico already has an import regulation and an ongoing pilot, regulated carbon market. Colombia has already have a law about cap and trade, but this law is not, it has not been regulated yet, so it's not enforced. We have other countries such as Colombia as well, and Chile, where we have carbon taxes, which is kind of different. But in Colombia, we have a carbon tax over the sales of fossil fuels, right? But companies can offset or reduce that payments purchasing carbon credits. So besides of that, in Latin America, we have some countries where we already have a voluntary carbon market, not regulated but voluntary. That is the case of Colombia. That is the case of Peru, and it could be also the case of Brazil. Voluntary carbon markets. Those carbon markets, as you know, the price is determined by the market, by the offer and demand. They are based on the carbon standards. But what is important here is that there are not few companies that are already paying for these carbon credits, but this is mainly for reputational reasons, because it is not mandatory there, right? So in general, Latin America has made progress in terms of carbon taxes and carbon markets, but our regulation is really very far behind of that of the European Union. And even of the carbon prices are not comparable. Really are not comparable for the context of this region, for the kind of offer that we can have in projects that offset emissions. It's very likely that carbon prices will remain substantially lower than those in the EU, in the foreseeable future, right? So then, for all those reasons, I believe that currently, I mean, that could change, of course, in the future, but currently there is not enough incentive for Latin American countries to implement a regulated carbon market, And that is mainly because the goods affected in this first stage, the goods affected by the CBAM, all the accounts, as I previously said, for 2.5 to 3.5 of the total value of our current exports. So, however, if the contributions or the carbon payments of the voluntary carbon markets can count for reducing the CBAM certificates, that's another story. Really? That's another story. Because that, of course, would be an incentive for Latin American countries, of course, to develop even more these voluntary carbon markets, to even it's also that an opportunity to generate more projects that offset the emissions. But I believe that is not affecting or jeopardizing the EU objective to leveling the playing field or to prevent carbon leakage, because the payment will be done, right? The payments will be done, and the payment and that value of those payments will remain in the country of origin of those exports. So for the other part of the question about if companies are preparing for the CBAM, I think not yet, and not yet because many companies may believe that this measure is not going to affect them in this first transition period of this first goods covered by the CBAM, because the EU is not like a very relevant market for the exports, right? That's nothing more far from the truth. And why is that? Because even if some countries or Latin American countries or companies decide not to continue export these goods to the EU, CBAM could still affect the region through a possible regulation of trade. That is, the CBAM could trigger trade diversion. Let's imagine that, for instance, in a hypothetical case, China, India, Turkey, or any other relevant player for these goods decided not to comply for a period with this measure, and they decide to divert the exports to countries where the Latin American export depend on, that of course put Latin American participation of those countries at risk. And also, and finally, that is something important to keep in mind, that in a scenario of reconfiguration of trade, that's a perfect setting for trade restrictive measures to be implemented, such as trade remedies, being safeguards that also could be a anti-dumping or countervailing duty measures, and those trade restrictive measures, of course, is something that we all have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Mariá, for sharing this very valid practical points. Now, back to Alessandro. We know that a few countries have raised already concerns about the WTO consistency of the EU CBAM. And in your paper, you discussed, as far as I understood, the certain aspects of border carbon adjustments in general, not specifically the EU CBAM, that could be problematic under WTO. So could you possibly choose 2 or 3 aspects that you think are the most problematic potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said correctly, the EU CBAM, which is a type of border carbon adjustment, which already was presented in practice. As the moment it was presented, raised concerns by India, among others, who requested consultations with the EU. And now it seems that the situation will proceed diplomatically to find some kind of dialogue. But definitely there are gray zones, several gray zones for border carbon adjustment mechanisms, and it's really quite a thin line that determines the WTO compatibility. So the design is quite crucial, and in our view, speaking also reflecting Goran's and my thoughts, it's very, very important that UNFCCC considerations, climate change considerations are kept in mind when designing CBAM. So to select three aspects, as you said, I think there can be issues in terms of national treatment, in terms of most favored nation treatment, but very importantly also concerning the coverage under the Article 20 GATT exceptions. Starting from national treatment, well, what is still quite unclear is whether carbon border adjustment could possibly qualify as a legitimate border tax adjustment under the GATT. And that's because what the CBAM is actually targeting is carbon emissions, which are some kind of output in the production process that is let's say, a byproduct that is not incorporated in the product itself, in the final product. So we're talking about so-called non-product related process and production methods, NPR, PPMs, which are quite unclear how these are regulated under WTO law. That's because the Working Party on border tax adjustment in 1970 didn't really take a position on this, and later on WTO jurisprudence, among others in the Superfund case, has provided some kind of opening towards the possibility of doing this, even though there isn't really a comparable situation there, because the Superfund case dealt with chemicals that were used, some kind of fertilizers used in the production process that somehow were incorporated in the final product. But what we're talking about with CBAM is instead something that goes out in the atmosphere while making the product, but it doesn't remain in the product itself. So the question here is whether adjusting for this type of externalities is still legitimate under the national treatment Article 3 GATT provisions. The second point, which also is very much crucial in terms of the design of CBAM, is most favored nation treatment. And that is particularly interesting because when the EU or another jurisdiction implements border carbon adjustment mechanism, essentially there is a fundamental choice to make, which is, do we want to treat all trade partners equally, or do we want to differentiate based on different circumstances of the trade partners? And the EU, it seems that the model that came out doesn't differentiate much. So all partners, all exporters towards the EU are subject to the same applicability of the CBAM, which in a way creates less problems from an MFN perspective, but on the other hand, doesn't really take into account crucial principles under the climate change regime, especially common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR, because clearly trading partners are in different situations, and the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, takes that very much into account. So not doing that risks to expose the CBAM to it not being really reflective of climate change principles. And this on its turn is also relevant, speaking of the exceptions under Article 20 of the GATT. Particularly here, we're talking about Article 20B on the protection of animal, human, plants, life and health, and Article 20G on the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. It seems that the case would be easier to make under 20G because of the necessity test being a bit less strict, also in the jurisprudence of the panel and the appellate body in US gasoline and also in US shrimp. So it seems easier there, but then we have the chapeau of Article 20 GATT to deal with. And under the chapeau, we believe that differentiating because of the different circumstances of trading partners would not constitute an arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination. On the contrary, it would very much be something that needs to be done. And similarly, under the national treatment perspective, differentiating because of the carbon intensity can be justified, but as long as there is a clear correlation between the measure and the emissions. So to conclude, we think that some aspects that should be kept in mind and perhaps improved in the EU CBAM is especially factoring in not only explicit carbon prices, but also implicit or effective policies such as standards that also deal with emissions in different jurisdictions, because otherwise we risk not capturing that aspect and the mechanism not really being reflective of the climate principles in the way it should. So I'll stop it here because I think I'm already over time.
Great. Thank you so much for keeping your time and for sharing this interesting perspective. Actually, I think the idea of how to take into account the CBDR in potential design of the water carbon adjustment is something that if you could develop this further with Goran, I think would be really valuable addition to the academic discourse on this matter. Now, Ilaria and Kateryna, in your paper, you address some of the potential issues under WTO law for climate clubs, and in particular the aspect of exclusiveness. And there you make some interesting arguments as to whether the potential inconsistency with the WTO rules or certain aspects of the climate clubs could be justified under Article 20H. And this is kind of a novel idea. And so I wanted to ask you to share with us how exactly you think that could apply and what are the limitations to applying that justification or invoking that justification.
Sure, thank you so much for the question. Just perhaps at the outset, building on what Alessandro already said, we in our paper developed the argument that obviously when you talk about climate floods, refer to three initiatives that we zoom in on. Our paper, the main obstacle in terms of WTO compatibility is the MFN clause, although we do elaborate upon a certain potential implications. Case law in particular cannot help us when it comes to the possibility to argue that because the fact that the import-inclusive feature of the EU CBAM and of the green steel and aluminum arrangements are actually PPM-based, that are origin neutral, only apply irrespective of origin, there could be some room of maneuver to be less categorical in the case of the EU CBAM. But apart from that, obviously we take the most obvious chance, and that is the fact that those initiatives are MFN compatible. And because of that, we develop the usual Article 20B and G arguments, but also focus on Article 20H, with particular respect to the one initiative that we find most at risk to be found MFN incompatible, even if we try to interpret as broad as possible the elements we have on the current interpretation of Article 1.1 in WTO case law that is existing. And here we found very interesting this exception because basically this exception justifies measures that are taken in pursuance of obligations under intergovernmental commodity agreements, the ECAs, right? So obviously this is an under used exception, and we are not the first one to try.
It's not our
but we basically found some interesting arguments with respect to the fact that the note to Article 20H that has to be interpreted says basically Article 20H needs to be interpreted in accordance with developing the law of drugs, the Charter of the International Trade Organization, addresses situations of disequilibrium between production and consumption, situations of surplus of commodities, in exceptional circumstances, you can also cover manufactured commodities, There is also elements that point towards the possibility to incorporate environmental relevant justification to the extent that it was also thought as a measure that could be in line with natural resources protection considerations. And because of that, we thought that maybe this would be an avenue for trying to justify global steel aluminum arrangement, which is, in our analysis, the weakest in shaping from WTO compatibility because of the way it merges clean trade conditions with fair trade conditions, which obviously cannot fly under the environmental exceptions that classically are thought most likely to be invoked for measures such as the CBAM, for instance, but also with respect to the chapeau dimension of the justification. So this is a little bit our analysis. We do not reach the conclusion that this exception will apply necessarily, although obviously there's a little bit of a leeway in the sense that it's not yet been interpreted, but obviously based on our paper, we find that the chapeau test is still very difficult to pass because from what we know, and obviously things are not necessarily very clear, under the arrangement based with the US and the EU, we condition access to your markets not only to recourse to low emission production technologies, but also to the condition that these productions are not subsidized, right? And obviously with respect to certain countries, at least this could be probably a precondition for engaging into decarbonization industrial processes. So in this respect, we find that even if there are some interesting new innovative elements into the article 28, the chapeau test is not.
Thank you very much. And of course, the general question that I think is up in the air there, because both you, Alessandro, and your co-author Goran, and you, Ilaria, and Kateryna, in your draft papers, you also address the potential need to address the potential compatibility with WTO law or climate clubs and border carbon adjustments through a potential waiver or an interpretive authoritative interpretation. But of course, we know how difficult it is to have either authoritative interpretation or a waiver. And therefore, I think the question that is in the air is, can you actually design a BCA or a climate club in a way that's going to be WTO consistent? But we can address that question maybe in a Q&A session. Alessandro, I wanted to also ask you to share with us some of the interesting ideas that you had on the potential role of the ISO as one of the organizations that you mentioned in your paper in promoting cooperation between WTO members in addressing the border carbon adjustments, or within the framework of the border carbon adjustments, and also your idea on the ex-ante review procedure, because I thought it was quite an interesting idea.
Definitely. So this is coming from the consideration again that a good CBAM, WTO compatible CBAM, should, to the largest extent possible, really reflect climate concerns. So it should be really closely connected to the carbon embedded in products. And in this connection, we thought that an organization like ISO, so the International Standard Organization for Standardization, among others, can be very helpful for the WTO. In this case of ISO, setting standards for certifying the amount of emissions embedded in the products can be useful to compare like products, as the WTO already does in several other instances. So this would be just building on something that already exists. And also the UNFCCC, perhaps with its subsidiary bodies, would provide some guidance and some more technical support in this. But broader than just this type of cooperation, what we believe is that there is a need to really leverage synergies that can exist between the WTO on one side and a constellation of other organizations, including also the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, in terms of developing methodologies to estimate effective carbon prices and thereby also expanding the applicability of CBAM beyond just explicit carbon prices, but comparing also other policies, other standards that in a way serve the same purpose of reducing emissions. Then other multilateral ways to go about CBAM would be introducing some kind of ex-ante mechanism to review, to discuss potential CBAM legislation before this enters into force. And this is, of course, what didn't happen in the case of the EU, and we see that now there are dialogues afterwards, which, I mean, if as a result it appears clear that there are divergences between trade partners, then there are two alternatives. Either the EU makes an amendment to the CBAM regulation or we'll have a trade dispute. So we believe that having a greater dialogue beforehand actually would be extremely beneficial, especially considering the fact that now we have one real CBAM, which is the EU's, but potentially in a couple of years from now, we have the UK's, the US, Canada, maybe even Brazil, maybe other countries will follow suit. And I think the proliferation of unilateral initiatives is really what could be opening up the floodgate of potential new trade wars, because then you have models that are quite different from each other. And if this happens in a manner that it's uncoordinated, then of course, parties will try naturally to defend their own models. So we're not saying that there is only one model and the result of ex-ante review or ex-ante consultations, negotiations will be to find out the perfect CBAM model, because possibly there can be plural, like multiple ones. But what will be important is to agree on certain key criteria, also given the current uncertainties in the WTO legal framework, on jointly designing a spectrum of possibilities that would be viable for CBAM. And in this sense, it's quite encouraging to see that the WTO, as a multilateral institution, is trying to reaffirm its central role in trade policy and also focusing on sustainability, which among others is also the theme of the public forum this year. So it's really the moment for the WTO to take some steps there, and the establishment of TESD and other initiatives, coalitions of trade ministers for climate, various fora that meet regularly should be where these discussions take place. Unfortunately, this is not really happening so far, and we see also TESD discussions have focused rather on subsidies, on some other aspects, but CBAM appears still as a very, very difficult topic to talk about. But we think that sooner or later, if countries go unilaterally, then legal issues will arise, disputes will come. So it might be better to start tackling them beforehand and leveraging this cooperation. And again, the UNFCCC Secretariat also should play a more central role to make sure the CBAMs are really following climate change principles in order to create better CBAMs and not adversarial and potentially WTO incompatible mechanisms. So these are just some thoughts on what could be done about it.
Thank you, Alessandro. And indeed, I think the question of the multiple different approaches to, for instance, calculating the embedded emissions is essentially a horror story for businesses, because they fear that already now you have a methodology proposed by the EU in the EU CBAM, but you have now discussions between the EU and the US on the carbon intensity under the GSSA. And so the typical question that we get is, are they going to use the same methodology? And then you have, of course, discussions on the introduction of CBAM in other countries like the UK or Canada. And again, we receive the same question from the companies: is the methodology going to be the same? Because if you can imagine that there's going to be 10 different methodologies, I think for companies, it's going to be very, very costly, if not impossible, to comply with all of them at the same time. Now, back to Ilaria and Kateryna. And the last point that I wanted to ask you to address is some of the ideas that you discussed in the paper on how climate clubs could be addressed in the preferential trade agreements and what are the limitations. That, and also you discuss, I found it very interesting, the possibility of the coexistence of different climate clubs, because again, what we see is, how, for instance, how GSSA is going to be reconciled with the EU CBAM.
Well, probably I will start from the second question. Actually, we are not saying that the coexistence is possible. We are just discussing the possibility of coexistence, and we are coming to the conclusion that it is not possible. And in our view, and what we really feel that in a short and medium term, these all three arrangements, if they come into existence, and we are not sure about the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, because at the moment, apparently, the differences between the US and the EU are very, very serious on that. But we think that if they all are coming into existence, they will be implemented separately. And the role for G7 will be more cooperative. And this probably the best what this G7 club can do at the moment is to negotiate and discuss, and then maybe also agree on the alignment of standards on methodology. And this is less sensitive issue or political issue, because when we are talking about CBAMs, these are an area of sovereignty of states, in fact taxes, and cooperation on that is more difficult, international cooperation, than on such issues as, say, methodologies or some approaches to tackling some maybe problems or implementation of the Paris Agreement, maybe transparency or even technology transfer issues, finance, etc. So that will be the area of our G7 climate club. But the EU CBAM will exist for some time unilaterally, that's for sure. And because even to integrate a CBAM generally into a climate club will be enormously difficult, because we are talking about the alignment of MRV, this is the monitoring and review and verification issues. We are talking about the agreement on common carbon price within club members, and this is in the situation when those G7 members have not the same approaches to climate policy and to measures taken to address climate change. The US and Japan don't have carbon prices and on the federal level, and the rest of G7 do have Canada too. But again, it's difficult to agree on a common carbon price. So let's start from that. And I'm not talking about the same external CBAM to non-members, because So, because again, we are talking about the same MRV, and also from the WTO point of view, how can these club members impose a carbon price, a CBAM, external CBAM, carbon price mechanism on non-members if within this climate club, these members have a price, a non-price mechanism. So from point of view of non-discrimination, in the WTO and this MFN, this is just important. So, but I'm not talking about WTO because, well, WTO maybe it's very important and the compliance is very important, etc. But let's start from the practical feasibility of this because this is what what matters the most. And when coming back to the question of PTAs, yes, we are discussing this as one of the avenues to deal with the problem of legal and political feasibility of CBAMs, but also other elements of climate class. This approach dealing with these trade-related climate policy measures under PTAs is interesting because PTAs they are about a wide scope of issues and which promise parties the parties of those agreements some economic benefits, and so they offer also this possibility for trade-offs between climate and economic interests of PTA parties. And to negotiate such issues on PTAs, it's difficult, still difficult, but maybe easier than in multilateral forum like the WTO. And in any case, even if CBAMs eventually will not become provisions in under those PTAs, just to use forums of PTAs, listing PTAs is useful because so countries, trading partners, they can just discuss these issues among each other, and they can mitigate the potential risk of retaliations, trade retaliations, and also I would say also the risk of a legal claim against these measures in the WTO, because of course nobody can prevent parties or PTAs to for this settlement. But if you negotiate these matters among each other, and maybe if you agree on the use of PTAs of the CBAMs in these bilateral relations, trade relations, then the probability that you would then go against it to the dispute settlement would be still lower because you agreed on some rules and gray. So this is our idea.
Was there all the other WTO members that might be interested parties?
But the whole limitation for this ocean PTA for the increase of G7 is that the US and the EU don't have a PTA. So that's what they look at them, but theoretically discuss these issues or it's Canada, UK, it's already discussed.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panels. I think you have offered a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of good food for thought, and also for discussion. And I would like to use now the opportunity to open the floor for the questions. We have about 20 minutes, and I will take maybe 3 first questions for the first round, and then please say if you want to address the question to a particular panelist or to all the panelists. And Greg, I think you were the first.
Great, thanks. It was a great panel. It was really striking to see sort of the impacts on Latin America and obviously in other countries. So I was just wondering, one thing for the EU to adopt this measure and to collect the revenue. Once it collects the revenue, of course, it could use it for EU industrial policy or anything it wants. And that seems more problematic to take that revenue from a country like Trinidad and Tobago or any developing country. Has there been any thought that one, that revenue should be sent back to the country, or 2, that it would be earmarked for some sort of climate change initiatives that would go back to that country?
I think Goran and then Jennifer.
I had just a comment that I think that you say things are not really happening at the WTO. Well, I can tell you that in the last year, for 30 years I worked for the WTO, we tried to push climate and trade. It was not going anywhere. But for about a year and a half now, it's in all committees, in all corridors, all the time. I think that one of the last meetings, there were 17 STCs, this new approach now that dispute doesn't work, special trade concern where countries raise their flag. It's a little bit what you say and they start talking. So this has changed enormously. And it is there, and you know that the COP is having a full day on trade. Hallelujah. At last, the UN now is bringing trade into the climate discussion. So thank you to the EU for that. Not that the EU system is perfect, but it's there. Now it is discussed.
Yeah, and just to add to what Gabrielle has mentioned, actually on the issue of methodologies and calculating carbon emissions, there was a very interesting workshop with the private sector, the WTO held earlier this year, which also shows that the WTO is recognizing the
World
concerns.
Steel Association asked that WTO launch into this. So it's there now.
Jennifer?
Well, great. Again, I would say fantastic panel, and thank you very much. Maybe just a comment, but then it feeds into the question that I wanted to ask, because when I step back from this, it strikes me that what you're seeing in this panel and in what you're discussing is a lot of this will kind of blurring or erasing some of the lines that we've seen. I mean, for me, that, climate change was often, one party saying, we're going to solve the problem through regulation, maybe in the United States, regulation plus subsidies, and the European Union is going to solve the problem through price-based mechanisms. And it strikes me that at some level, some of these are now, if you will, starting to blend, which sort of feeds into a little bit of my question. But the other one that I think you're clearly seeing happening is, again, this blurring of the line between the imposing of sanctions and the use of standards. And that's another one where we really see it. Initially, a lot of these discussions started out with, I'm going to sanction, I'm going to tax, I'm going to do something to those things that I think are not consistent with my notions of climate change or human rights or whatever else. I'm gonna sanction. Now we're going over to the realm of standards where we're simply going to say whatever your good has to be X amount of clean, or else I simply don't want it. It has to be not made with forced labor, or else I don't import it. It has to be somehow meeting a standard, or else I don't allow it to come into my market. And yet I'm not describing that as a sanction. I'm saying that's a standard, and it's my right to set a standard, and that is now distinct from the imposition of a sanction. And all I'm saying is, to me, these are at some level, both of them are sort of two sides of a coin to some degree, and yet we're sort of in the vein of thinking about regulation as permissible and standards as applying as permissible, and sanctions and price mechanisms maybe not as easily compatible with WTO law, which leads me sort of to my question, just slightly a data question, and slightly maybe, again, a question going to this issue of where the WTO is coming out on helping with standards, which is all of your data, I assume, presumes that all of the exports would pay, if you will, the full amount of the CBAM. And I guess I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding where the EU CBAM really is, because again, the United States always made the argument to the Europeans, how dare you do this? And the response from the Europeans was always, but if your goods are clean, the United States says your steel is oh so clean because we have a lot of electric arc mini mills and less blast oxygen furnaces. Your steel is oh so clean. You won't pay very much, because when we calculate it down at the product level, your products will show up as clean, so you won't actually pay any CBAM. So what are you complaining about? Right? It's a theoretical complaint. It's not a real complaint. I'm just making sure, is that right? Is that actually right? And if so, is it right for everyone? In other words, it presumes that you can actually calculate the amount of greenhouse gases that are in this particular ton of steel according to the methodology that the European Union is telling you to calculate it by, and therefore you can show that in fact your steel is clean. And that might be true for multinational corporations, and many steel corporations are multinational corporations. It might not be true for others. And then the second little part of this question is, to some degree, the standards issues become very tricky, partly in the climate change side, anytime you're bringing in the source of your power, the source of your energy. Because again, it's one thing to tell big companies in the United States, go find a clean source of power because they're actually available. It's a whole other thing to tell that, to countries which literally the only source of power is coal-fired. That's all that there is. There's nowhere they can go to get any other source of power. To now tell them we're going to bring in power, sources of power, as part of the calculation of your emissions, inherently raises, I don't want to say discrimination for MFN, but inherently raises issues for some of the developing countries because there's nothing goes for you. So again, just sort of a comment, but also kind of a question of how do we think about those?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So who would like to address the first, maybe first 3 questions, and then if we have time, we take some more questions. So the first question on the revenue.
Yes, so that's the Achilles heel, right? Within the CBAM. I mean, there's been a lot of literature on the proposals at first, and then on the actual regulation and actually the issue of, what is the use going to do with the revenues is obviously very critical for the purposes of the double compatibility, right? We've done a lot of work on that, and obviously this is very relevant for the purposes we find of justifying the measure under the chapeau of Article 20. Now, there's been an evolution. If you look at the proposal of the Commission, and if you look at the text that was actually passed by the European Parliament, and if you look at the final regulation that was approved, there's some language in the recital that says the EU is going to support through its budget developing countries, especially least developed countries, in their efforts towards decarbonization, but there's no clear commitment yet. But the EU, I think, is perfectly aware of this particular weakness within the design of the proposal. I also want to go back to maybe address quickly, I'm sure Kateryna compliment with respect to Jennifer's question, with respect to what is the actual cost that's going to be imposed on the part of exporters to the EU because of CBAM. And indeed, if you read a number of documents from the Commission, Parliament as well, they basically say it's true. I mean, if you look at our credibility mechanism, we are only going to explicitly provide for partial exemption only with respect to imports coming from countries that have introduced an explicit carbon pricing mechanism, right? So we're not going to acknowledge through a CBAM feature an implicit carbon pricing. And the reason is because it's very difficult to calculate the equivalence. I mean, that triggers a whole lot of other problems that could also have relevance on law for non-discrimination, compatibility, etc., etc. But then the argument goes exactly along the lines we're talking about, right? I mean, to the extent that you actually have strong non-implicit carbon pricing within your own jurisdiction, those products are actually going to be containing less carbon, right? And so you're going to actually pay this no problem because you're going to pay lower. We've done a paper with Joseph Francois, who's an economist, and we actually examined this issue from the perspective of the fact that because of these differences in methodologies and the difficulties in complying with MRV standards they do, maybe not multinationals, but as you say, small and medium enterprises are going to face huge compliance costs. And therefore, you're just going to go with default values. And because default values are actually envisaging the regulation in a way that you're actually punitive, these will actually raise a real problem when you're starting to invest in life.
Maybe I can very shortly add to that on price and non-price mechanisms. I think here we have to understand that they are not the same. It's not only about the administrative complexity and disagreement and the absence of methodologies of how to make this comparability between these price and non-price mechanisms or policies measures. But it's also about the fact that they are not the same. Because when you pay, when we're talking about price mechanisms, then the producers have to pay twice. They have to pay for the abatement because the law demands from them this abatement, this reduction. And they also have to pay then for the rest of emissions that are still in the products. So they pay twice. And in the case of non-price mechanism, producers pay only once. They pay for technologies to reduce their emissions. Point. That's the difference. So in any case, even if there are methodologies to make them comparable, still in the end, non-price mechanisms will not value the same as price mechanisms. This is one thing. And on the question of revenues, there are different options. We discussed previously how to satisfy the chapeau of Article 20. And all of them try to give these revenues away from the EU to either developing countries or to private funds. Well, the EU decided not to give it back to developing countries and least developed countries, just for the simple reason that this will not stimulate these countries to reduce emissions. And it decided probably to maybe somehow in the future to exchange it for technology, for support of technology, financial assistance, etc. But to give it to climate funds, I think that is probably the best way to deal with the chapeau issues of Article 20.
I'll have also a comment about the revenues. I think that probably it could be the most important issue in practice, right? Because it is how much each country is going to pay. And it seems like the only issue that is important here is the payment, the carbon payment actually made in the country. That is like the only real issue behind here. And what is I think is controversial here is that, I mean, we can come up with some methodology to measure the emissions, but what I think is very hard is to make the carbon prices compatible, because that is something that is not going to happen, especially if you compare the carbon prices with developing countries with the EU. That is something that is very, very hard to make compatible. So, of course, that is something that we have to bear in mind. And also, it's important what you just said about how the source of power, because there are some things that are taken into account about the source of power. Of course, there are some developing countries and any other countries that their source of power is mainly carbon or fossil fuels. But for example, for many Latin American countries, as Colombia or Argentina or Brazil, it's a hydroelectrical source of power. So that is clean energy, and that is not something that is taken that much into account for calculating the measure.
So just maybe very briefly before I give the floor to Alessandro. So the issue of revenue, as things currently stand, is the 25% of the revenue will go back, well, will stay with member states, and 75% go to the EU. And then whatever goes to the EU is the EU's own budget. And then there is no clear link as to where this money will go. And of course, I mean, there has been discussion also in the legislative process, developing countries saying that, well, if you collect the money, you need to have some type of programs to give this money back to at least developed countries, but there is no clear link established. And I think that is also, that explains the reaction of some countries that are affected by the CBAM to have their own carbon pricing at home. So that's at least, there will be some carbon price. Maybe it will be lower than the EU carbon price, but they will pay a certain carbon price at home, and then this money can be then reinvested into adjusting and cleaning the. Alessandro, would you like to comment? And then maybe we'll have time for one or two very brief questions.
To respond very briefly to Gabriel, I think it's really encouraging to hear how much has been going on. And I mean, that's also what I meant. The thing where I think CBAM is still that thorny issue is that if we look, for example, at the G7 Climate Club, like it's possible even among more like-minded countries in the G7 to discuss climate and trade cooperation in general terms, but then the CBAM issue is more problematic because of the different carbon pricing mechanisms and the lack thereof and so on. Similarly, I think the steel and aluminum agreement, it's also in a way to avoid the CBAM issue. Like, let's just cooperate on these two sectors and then forget about the rest. So I think that is where CBAM is still maybe not on the same pace as other cooperation areas, but definitely the fact that the COP will have a trade day is a very big development, and I think it's really gone in the direction that climate and trade policy would be agreed and synchronized a bit more and not go into different directions.
Great. I think we still have a few minutes for two very brief questions, and Gracia, I think, wanted to ask one, unless it was already resolved, and then Tim side.
It's fine, I'll just have the question, and feel free not to respond. One was to, because it's not an easy question. One was to Ilaria and
question for reception.
And Kateryna, and I was just curious of whether you look into your paper beyond WTO compatibility at the climate change compatibility with the international climate change regime or these climate clubs, because if I understand correctly, these climate clubs are all about making comparable efforts. Yeah, towards climate change mitigation, whereas the climate change regime is based on the completely different presumption of differentiated efforts. Yeah, so will this climate club ever be open when they are based on an assumption that goes against the main premise or the foundational principle of the international climate change regime? That's one question. The second one to also Alessandro and you was on this idea of the non-price and price mechanism and how to compare them. I mean, Kateryna said, it's practically impossible to compare. We're never going to manage to compare non-price and price policies. It's very difficult to do in practice. But my question is, do we really need to? Because it seems when we're having this debate that we talk about the EU having this CBAM and price mechanism, and the others having other policies, but that's not the reality. I mean, the CBAM adjusts for the ETS, which is the carbon pricing mechanism in the EU. But the EU has in place many other regulations as well. So if we take into account those other regulations for these 10 countries, why not for the EU itself? And then for me, it becomes a mess because, where do you stop comparing? So I don't know, maybe my question is a bit stupid and I don't understand, but I really don't understand the debate between the comparability of non-price and pricing policies in the context of CBAM. Let's say the CBAM adjusts for the carbon price mechanism, but not for the other policies that the EU has in place.
I mean, also on the adjustment and comparability, there is a very interesting recent article by Dan Esti on the effect of BCAs or BCAs taken into account, not the explicit, but the effective carbon pricing. Esti, yeah. Tim?
I just have a quick question.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. The proliferation of CBAMs, they were to go for the EU model where everyone starts adopting. The EU realizes its vision, and countries start adopting explicit carbon prices in order to get credit and get them. One problem you mentioned is the methodology problem. The second problem, though, which is related to that, is just the paperwork problem. This is a massive non-tariff barrier to trade that the EU is taking on here. And so a solution to that is something like GASA, or it doesn't have to be GASA, but something else that looks more like a sectoral free trade area. That introduces a bunch of other problems that you all alluded to from a WTO law point of view, but also solves the massive trade barrier problem that common unilateral CBAMs. So I'm just curious how you all think about that trade-off. It seems like maybe superficially it does better from a WTO point of view, but once you take into account the real world impact on businesses, it seems to me like the more pure club model is actually better. This has been my sense of talking to European businesses. They prefer GATSA for these reasons, and I'm curious what you will.
Yes.
This will reduce the say gas.
Just a quick green, aluminum and steel arrangement.
Do you have an urgent question?
Yeah, I just wanted to back on what you said. We have to understand the European CBAM as a response to the subsidies in the emission trading system. And this approach was chosen to bring down the subsidy elements in the emission trading system, because only without subsidies we can comply with the non-discrimination. And other approaches based on tariffs were not used. My question would be, could you contemplate that other countries are using export tariffs on non-product related PPM basis for products produced in a conventional way, while not imposing export tariffs for clean products? So the money would actually stay within the country, and the system could be accounted and be deducted within the EU. I mean, we have to find practical solutions for countries to respond to that challenge, particularly those who don't have an option to change energy supplies here. And in other countries, we're actually working on their own CBAMs. I encourage them to look into a simple tariff solution. And the EU and the government here has a system in place we could use. So I just wanted to ask what the panel thinks about this.
So we have about 3 minutes, 3-4 minutes.
Because we already over time, but we started a bit later, so very brief responses. Ilaria, Kateryna.
Maybe I can very quickly address the issue of sectoral arrangements. I agree that sectoral arrangements, sectoral approach to CBAMs has a limited potential. It has potential, but limited because it depends on sectors, what we are talking about. There is a good solution to actually how to avoid these complexities with carbon prices and the use of carbon prices as the basis for CBAM. You can simply say that you would provide market access based on technologies, like if products are produced clean in sectors. Depending on technologies, of course, for those sectors, then you can agree on free trade in those products. So instead of carbon prices, just the way the products are produced, but for particular types of products, where it is possible to agree on, if there are no complexities in technology, but technologies are simple and it's clear, this is clean and this is not clean. Then it's sectoral would work. And on climate law issues of climate plans, we didn't deal with it in our paper, but in principle, it goes against the bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement. So for sure.
Just compliment, because she answered the first question. Maybe I will address very briefly the second question, but this is requires reception talk, obviously. But I just
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back into this mirroring concept, right? So the EU has always sort of tried to sell the EU CBAM as a mirroring instrument to the EU ETS, but at the same time, it's an alternative carbon leakage instrument that's attached to the phasing out of the allowances. And the extent that you bring in the carbon leakage narrative, I think precisely because once you want to address carbon leakage, you're basically intruding into climate change related discussions more generally. You will need to accommodate for the differentiation approach that is inherent into the Paris Agreement, which is vital for justification under Article 20. And this is the reason why this whole discussion about pricing, explicit pricing discussion comes into the picture. But it's just, I agree, this is just a mirroring instrument that's supposed to be just balancing out the EU ETS, but carbon leakage approach allows for discussion into whether the differentiation element of the Paris Agreement should be brought, should be used for chapeau analysis purposes, let's say. So, Mariá, Alessandro, very quick comments. The first one is I totally agree that we are just talking about how the revenue that is going to be, but we're losing like one very important thing is and is that implementation, of course, is going to be very costly, even if the EU is telling that it will not be. But in real life, where really keeping all those documents for years, and all of other requesting for the CBAM certificates and all of that, of course, that impose a trade barrier, of course. Probably some of the collector revenue are going to be to cover that cost. But also I see in line with your question that for some countries, a very good way to try to compensate or to offset this burden is, if it's possible, to count the payments in the not regulated carbon market, the voluntary carbon market, for compensate or for to obtain that reduction of this rate. Because at the end, it's a carbon payment. Even if it's, could be, and countries should be able to buy as much credits in their countries of origin as possible to try to equal the price than the European Union. But at the end, it is a payment. It is a carbon payment. So I think that could be also an option that should be considered. Alessandro?
Okay, very briefly, to Gracia, I would just say that I think the paper you mentioned, the paper you mentioned, with by the next, I think it's with my co-author Goran together. So I'm sure that he will have a lot to say on the issue of explicit and effective carbon pricing. So unfortunately, he's not here, but maybe it would be great also to involve in the discussion. And to Thomas, I think it is really very good solution in my view, that of keeping it in the country of origin rather than having the EU imposing a fee, but rather having this export tariffs if the goods are made in a way that is more carbon intensive, as long as it's not an export subsidy for the greener goods, which probably would be a bit more problematic. I think the main issue there would be, again, to agree on methodologies, because in the sense that voluntary cooperation, like, it's great, but do you count it based on the EU ETS? But then what if a third country needs to be compliant with the EU and the potential UK, US? Like, there needs to be an agreement on what do we measure it against. But then I would be very much in favor of keeping it in the country of origin, rather than having this floor of revenue going to another country and then perhaps going to the Green Climate Fund or some other project. It's an unnecessary complexity, but that's more like realistic, unfortunately, than the other better model that would be keeping it there.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for their insightful presentations. Thank you very much to the audience, and we hope we kept you awake despite the fact that I think 3/4 of the auditorium are jet lagged. So thank you for staying with us. And Marcus would like to say a few words, so please don't leave yet.
Yes, we're exit right now. Our hosts are planning to put everyone here. So just take away the center of the.